Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This life science-focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to keep you up to date. Xtalks is excited to introduce the inaugural issue of Xtalks Clinical Edge, where innovation meets expertise. This digital magazine offers you exclusive conversations with some of the brightest minds and trendsetters of the clinical trials community, offering you a front row seat to the evolving landscape of clinical research. As you dive into the rich content of Xtalks Clinical Edge magazine's first issue, you'll discover insights from pharmaceutical companies, patient advocacy groups, leading clinical research organizations, and an ensemble of key opinion leaders from organizations like the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and the Mayo Clinic. Follow the link in the show notes or visit clinicaledge.xtalks.com/issue 1 to dive into the first issue of Xtalks Clinical Edge magazine and be a part of the conversation shaping the next era of clinical trials. That's clinicaledge.xtalks.com/issue 1.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Aisha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm delighted to introduce a very special guest on the show. We have with us today Ben Sexson, co-founder and CEO of Monogram Orthopedics, a company dedicated to revolutionizing orthopedic joint replacement through the use of surgical robotics. The company is focused on developing patient-optimized orthopedic implants at scale by linking 3D printing and robotics with advanced preoperative imaging. Ben is an engineer by training, and prior to joining Monogram, he served as the Director of Business Development at Pro-Dex, an OEM manufacturer of Orthopedic Robotic End-Effectors. At Pro-Dex, Ben was responsible for the development, management, and launch of a proprietary product solution, helping to negate a distribution agreement with a major strategic partner. To learn more about how Monogram Orthopedics offers customized implants and facilitates minimal processing and coordination time for orthopedic joint replacements, let's turn to Ben Sexson to learn more. Ben, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Aisha. Great to be with you.
Likewise. And so, Ben, could you start us off by telling us about how and when Monogram Orthopedics was founded?
Sure. So Monogram was founded by a practicing surgeon who's still doing the replacement out of Mount Sinai. His name is Dr. Yunus. And Dr. Yunus is a technophile. He has used almost kind of every advanced technology in the orthopedic market. And he saw a real opportunity in the area of robotics to really take robotics to the next generation or iteration and combine robotics with some other technologies, that kind of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and 3D printing, and really push the envelope of what robots combined with kind of novel manufacturing methods could do.
And what led you specifically to venture into robot-assisted implants? You have a background in engineering, of course, and so it makes sense to go over into a field like this, but in the biotech or the medical device side, I'm sorry. And so what led you to join Monogram?
Sure. So, Dr. Yunus is a pretty charismatic surgeon and pretty good salesman. And, I met Dr. Yunus in 2017, and at the time he was kind of in the early stages of trying to commercialize what has now become the Emboss surgical robot. And he kind of shared with me his vision. I was in the orthopedic space and had interacted with most of the large companies in the space, and I had come to understand that our industry is very slow moving. The incumbent players are very large companies, tremendously inefficient, The average company in our space is over 100 years old, and it kind of has come to be reflected in terms of the pace of innovation in our space. And the leading robot on the market was starting to get old, but was obvious that it was very dominant. And it was also obvious that other players in the space were kind of failing to recognize what was so valuable and the accomplishments of the Mako system, which is kind of the preeminent robot in our space. And, whenever there's kind of a disconnect between the market capitalizing on opportunities and a significant opportunity, it's kind of an interesting thing for an entrepreneur. And both Doug and I realized that there really was an opportunity for a next generation surgical robot that surgeons really kind of want to use that solves a lot of the pain points of robotics. Aisha, when you look at robotics today, 88% of knee replacements are still done with manual instruments. But Mako has 90% market share in robotics, and that's not just because they're a first mover. There's some compelling things about what their robot can do that it's now become very obvious that some of the competitors are failing to kind of take advantage of. So there was really just this kind of tectonic shift happening. The market is moving to press fit implants. It's moving to 3D printed implants. But robots really are kind of underutilized, even though they're kind of growing. And we think we understand why that is, and we think we can address that with novel technology. So that's really the kind of the genesis is trying to capitalize on what is a very significant opportunity in the orthopedic space. And I'd love to get into as much of the weeds as you're interested in getting into about why that is. But we see a very significant opportunity both in the United States and overseas for next generation surgical robot that solve some of the problems that the current solution failed to solve.
And you mentioned that the pace of innovation has been quite slow or stagnant in this space, mentioning companies that have been around for 100 years. And so what are, related to that, what are the unmet needs in joint replacements? And so where is the innovation lacking, and what are the gaps, and how does Monogram come in? And how does it commit itself to innovating in the field?
Sure. So I'd say, what's interesting, Aisha, is I kind of entered the space. I knew a lot about orthopedics. I wouldn't have called myself a knee replacement expert. And I thought that the combination of robotics with custom implants was kind of an obvious application for the technology. And nobody was really doing that. And that was kind of our unique angle. The more I got into really what a knee replacement involves and why, really understanding kind of the science behind why Mako has been so successful, it was pretty alarming to me how ignorant I think a lot of these large company executives are about the nuances of what makes a good knee replacement. So specifically, when you think about a robotic execution of a knee, there's really I think a lot of people only think about how accurately can a robot remove bone. So, let's say you need to make a 7mm resection. How good is the robot at removing 7 millimeters of bone? I think that's where a lot of people stop. But there's actually two accuracies that matter. There's also the accuracy of virtual planning. So really understanding if you put an implant in a certain position, what is the impact on basically the kinematics of the knee? How does that affect the, let's say, the laxity in the knee? And there's really only one system on the market, in our opinion, that does that very well, which is Stryker. And it isn't really until you understand how they've fundamentally changed how surgeons think about the procedure that you can really appreciate why they're so successful. And I think if you were to take a poll of analysts and the criticism of Mako going back to maybe 2017, 2018, a lot of people thought they would fail, and really they thought they would fail for the simple reason that robotics are not solving economic problems, right? They take longer in the operating room. They cost hospitals money. There's all of these extra costs from consumables, and all of the criticisms of the Mako system from that time period are still kind of pertinent today. You have these, you have to place pins. There's fracture risk. There's infection risk. And if you were just to look at it and say, without knowing how well they did, the objections seemed very valid. But what everybody failed to appreciate is how being able to accurately navigate and plan where to put the implants and how implant planning affects laxity and doing that accurately, how that kind of changes the way surgeons think about the procedure at a very fundamental level. That's really what I think gets missed by a lot of people in the space. And I'm thoroughly convinced that robotics will take over. And it's really just a matter of robots addressing some of those economic challenges that are kind of the last mile to full-blown adoption. So we are very focused on surgical time and without compromising kind of the benefits that make Mako very special. For example, the accuracy of their laxity measurements. So that's really our goal, is to solve the economic challenges that come with robotics that are not solved today. So robots today add incremental cost and incremental time, and we think that technology can help address those two barriers to adoption. So we're working on a robot that we think is going to be very fast and also require less consumables.
And so can you tell us a bit more about Monogram's technology in developing this robot, and also really how I know that the company is very focused on patient centricity and to really customize these implants, which I think perhaps was lacking in the field previously. And so I think with, how really is Monogram attempting to achieve those goals?
Sure. Yeah. So so to start out with, we're kind of enabling surgeons to do everything they can do now, but with much better planning. So we're kind of our first gen system is going to commercialize FDA approved implants that we've already cleared. That's an implant that we've licensed that has a pretty solid clinical track record and is very consistent with current state of the art in terms of press fit implants. So we're going to take a generic implant and we're going to combine it with our robotic system. And what's kind of novel about our robot is that every robot on the market today that has kind of widespread adoption is still overly reliant on the user, which is the surgeon, and really requires the user to kind of move the system around. So for example, with Mako, the surgeon has to move the end effector around to actually execute the cutting. And there's still kind of a degree of surgeon skill that we think needs to be taken out. And we also believe that it's very hard to fully optimize a system that requires significant user input. If you were to look at a automated, let's say a factory, you'd be pretty surprised to see a lot of machine shop operators kind of moving, manually preparing whatever they're making. You'd expect to see kind of fully automated 5 or 6 axis machines that are kind of continuously milling. It's kind of the same thing in robotics. We think that the future of robotics is active, which means the user isn't actually doing any thinking about, say, cut paths or required to move the robot around. It's kind of fully autonomous, but with the user still in the loop, but without the user being kind of needing to be thoughtful about where the robot goes. The robot's already kind of figured out the most optimal way to remove bone. And so we've kind of taken a lot of the skill out, and we're really focused on making the surgical time as quick and efficient as possible. And then over time, what we're going to do is we're going to take that generic implant once we have surgeon adoption of our system, and we're going to introduce patient-specific implants with our robotic system. So that's going to be kind of the second layer, is to upgrade the implant to a more custom solution that we think will address some of the clinical limitations of generic implants. And that's going to be implants that would basically be robot only. It would be very difficult to place them without a robotic system. And that's really kind of where we think it's going, where you're unconstrained in terms of thinking about implant design and the instrumentation. With a robot, you're much less constrained in terms of how a robot can prepare bone than if you had manual instruments. So that's kind of the second piece of it, is to first is really solve the robot problem and drive robot adoption, and then the second piece is to introduce novel implants that we think will address some of the clinical limitations of generic implants, and not only clinical limitations but cost limitations. It's incredibly expensive to distribute implants and requires a ton of inventory. So that's one of the really attractive things about patient-specific.
And I know that you mentioned as well that you received FDA clearance for what's called the PressFit CKS Total Knee last year in 2022. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So, we were originally going to be commercializing our first gen robot. So just kind of backing up, when you submit a robot for FDA approval, to kind of validate the performance of your robot, you have to have an implant that goes with that. So the robot has to show, you have to be able to show the FDA that your robot can place an implant, and to do that, you have to have an implant. And our original plan was to have our first gen implant be a patient-specific implant. But over time, we felt that it was really kind of asking too much and a little bit ambitious to try and clear a custom implant and a novel robot. So we were able to secure a license for a total knee that was already FDA cleared. And we made improvements to that knee. So we secured a license, and we then took that knee and invested in that knee to make it better than it was. We upgraded certain features of the knee to make it a really solid press fit knee. And so that's going to be the knee that we commercialize out of the gate, is a licensed press fit total knee. And we have a supply agreement that went along with that license. So there's really kind of not much risk in terms of an FDA approval from the implant side. The focus is entirely on commercializing the robot. But there's not really any kind of barriers to adoption that we see of our system because of the implant. Any surgeons we've brought in to see the implant are fine with it and satisfied that it's totally fine and a worthwhile implant. So that was kind of the strategy we did. And now from this point forward, really the focus is entirely on getting our robot cleared. We think that's going to be the most accretive thing for our shareholders. And, Aisha, it's probably worth just mentioning our strategy to do that. So we were entirely a U.S. focused company. So our entire focus was getting FDA clearance in the U.S. And we actually had an opportunity, a large strategic international strategic reached out to us about an opportunity in another country, and the opportunity to kind of potentially launch a robot in their market, which we have been exploring. We announced that we delivered our first robot, our first commercial system, a couple of weeks ago. And so there's an opportunity for us to launch commercially outside the U.S. and get clinical data, live patient data outside the U.S. And we think that will has the potential to really accelerate our time to market in the United States, and will provide commercial validation of the system kind of before we would have gotten it if we were only reliant on the U.S. approval. So that's pretty exciting, and has really kind of moved the ball forward for us in terms of when we expect our system to be performing surgery on patients. So to that end, we expect to be performing surgery on live patients in the first quarter of next year.
Excellent. And so I think that relates to the point where recently you had a major distributor, your first sale to them. Mm-hmm. And so, and how that was a key step towards your goal of broader commercialization.
Exactly. Yeah, that was a really big deal for us. It isn't really until you kind of ship your first product and deliver it. And I recently was traveling to make sure that system was brought online and everything was good. We actually did a number of cadaver labs in country, and those went flawless. And so everything's looking really good. But right now we're just finishing up various verification tests that we need to do, various protocols to make sure that the system is ready for live patient validation. And it's going to be getting real. We're going to do live surgery. We anticipate pretty soon. So things are moving very quickly. And really, this is the vision of the company, was always to really kind of move the state of the art forward in orthopedics and the standard of care forward. And while we certainly have our sights set on the U.S. market, it's extremely fulfilling that we're going to be kind of being used pretty soon. And we anticipate that it will make a clinical difference. But obviously, the clinical data we capture will have to substantiate that.
Indeed, that is quite exciting, and congratulations on that milestone. Indeed. And I think just in general, I wanted to ask also in terms, I think you touched on this in terms of just the slow pace of innovation in the field and things like that. But what are some of the other challenges in the field of orthopedics joint replacements with respect to developing new tools and technologies for better devices and to improve patient outcomes and patient care ultimately? What are some of the bottlenecks, I think?
Yeah. So, from a startup perspective, one of the things that's really challenging is access to capital. There haven't really been, there's been a lot of failures in terms of startups that have kind of made big splashes in the orthopedic market, and it's a very challenging market for small companies to compete in because the cost to get FDA approval is very significant, and all of the inventory required to kind of launch the system is very significant. And so it really becomes a little bit of a chicken and egg problem for startups where they have to move the technology so far forward that it becomes kind of prohibitive before somebody's interested. And so that's really one of the hardest things for entrepreneurs in our space. We had the same challenges. Monogram was actually crowdfunded, so we don't have any VC institutional capital that's invested to date. the vast majority of our capital has come from investors. Our average, just crowd investors, retail investors. Our average investor is about 65 years old, and from what we can tell, just from engagement with our investors, they have some affinity to, joint replacement. They either have had a joint replacement, need to have one, know somebody who's had one, and they kind of care deeply about the technology and want to see the standard of care pushed forward. So it's really a tough space for small companies, and there's just a kind of a scarcity of capital, and that makes it very difficult for new technologies to come to market. The regulatory process, kind of the barriers to entry are pretty significant. It takes a lot of capital to get a device to market. So to kind of give you some idea, it's all just sort of ballpark estimates that have been provided to us. But let's say you want to run a clinical trial, and for a total knee, it could be as much as could exceed $30,000 per case that a company has to pay, and you can imagine how that starts to add up. So that's really what makes it so hard for small companies to commercialize. But that also creates an opportunity. There really hasn't been a lot of innovation in our market, as far as we can see. The startups in our space really have a hard time accessing capital. So it's a bit of a two-edged sword, but we just continue to kind of push forward, and obviously now commercially launching is a really big deal, because it rather than speculating about whether or not we have a good product and speculating about how it competes with kind of the current state of the art, we're going to be able to see that real time. So pretty exciting.
Indeed. And just in general, a broader question, I guess, is how far has the field come, and in what direction is it evolving? Of course, robotics, surgical robotics is at the forefront or at the helm of a lot of the innovations, but sort of, are there any specifics around that? And in addition to that, any other innovations that are defining the field at the moment?
Sure. So, I would say for robotics, there's we see a couple of really interesting, opportunities. For example, the just navigation as a whole. The way that we are currently, tracking patients and returning the information to the robotic system about kind of where the patient is in space. That whole technology pipeline is, everybody's kind of doing the same thing. So typically you'll see sort of some variation of a IR camera that's looking at some rigid array that's mounted to the bone, and most of the main robots in the space kind of use similar tracking. And there's obviously some variations of that theme, but for the most part, that's how people track the bone. We think that that's an opportunity for innovation, where we get rid of the rigid arrays and the point-based registration methods that they take a lot of time, and they're very frustrating to surgeons. So it's a big focus area for Monogram, is to try and think about new methods of navigation that are less invasive and faster. We think there are significant opportunities in terms of just what AI can do over time for streamlining the planning process. So kind of when a surgeon's virtually planning the placement of an implant, we think that whole pipeline is ripe for optimization. As we start to correlate outcomes to the surgical plan, we think that that's really data that's very rich in terms of how it can help us streamline workflows. Those are two areas that are pretty interesting to us, and we think also just sort of thinking about using preoperative data to anticipate what's going to happen in the operating room. Just kind of one of the challenges we have in our space is that, for example, when we're assessing laxity of the joint, it's hard to know until the surgeon's kind of in the operating room doing the procedure, kind of what the laxity is and how the anatomy is going to be impacted by removing bone. And we're very interested in trying to think about how to anticipate that before as early in the process as possible, let's say. There's a lot of really unique opportunities, but the main thing really is how do we get more and more surgeons to use robotics? And I think a lot of it is still kind of an education. When we bring in surgeons who have not used robotics, a lot of the information that's being provided to them is new, and it takes a little bit of time for them to understand kind of the value proposition of being able to use the data they have. There's kind of a relearning that happens in terms of just a paradigm shift in terms of how they think about what a knee replacement is and how to do one. And so we think the future is very bright, and over time we think that it's going to be especially as we kind of the theory around what a perfect knee replacement looks like evolve. We think robots are going to become more and more ubiquitous over time. So it's an exciting time to be a robot company, and the challenge is just proving that out and the overcoming the kind of the barriers to entry with the FDA and so forth.
And so what can we expect in terms of the short and long-term goals at Monogram in the coming months and years?
Sure. So, domestically, we've been engaged with the FDA and had a number of formal meetings with the agency, and they've accepted our predicate device, and now it's just kind of a matter of figuring out, really refining what the optimal path forward looks like from a clinical strategy standpoint. And we're continuing to interact with them and kind of figure out that. And then we, as you mentioned, we've already shipped our first system, and we are working very hard to support the customer that is looking to deploy that. And there's a regulatory process that they have to go through. It's much faster than the FDA, but that involves the legwork. So we're doing all we can to support them, and we're cautiously optimistic that that's a pretty significant opportunity for us. So we have a number of balls in the air. We're pretty excited. The system will be performing surgery on live patients pretty soon, we anticipate. And so, yeah, it's pretty exciting. We have on the order of 27,000 investors, and I would say a lot of them are really dedicated to our mission, which is to advance the standard of care in orthopedics. And we think that's going to happen. I really want to see that happen in the U.S. market as soon as possible, but it's pretty exciting that it will be happening, and we think we will be having an impact on patients' lives very soon. So we're incredibly grateful for all of our investors who have supported that, and it's going to be an exciting time. And please, if you've been a Monogram follower, please stay tuned. We're going to try and kind of bring folks along on that journey um, through videos and social media and things as much as we can.
Excellent. We'll be keeping our eye out for that indeed. And yeah, really looking forward to what Monogram will be bringing into this space. And, congratulations on the milestones so far and really exciting things happening.
I'm pretty proud of how it's performing right now. And we think it has the potential to have an impact. So
indeed, next gen revolutions coming your way for Monogram, indeed. Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on the show, for sharing all of the wonderful work happening at Monogram. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Aisha. Really appreciate it as well.
Thank you. And so we look forward to more great things coming out for Monogram, and we'll keep our eye out for that.
Definitely.
All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and see you all next week. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media, email podcast@xtalks.com, or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.